Sweet, so we are live. Welcome everybody to round 2 of the NZIER Nationals 2021. My name is Izzy, I'm going to be your chair today. The first thing that I'd like to get both teams to do is if we can just run through affirmative and negating, state your speaker position, your name, and then gender pronouns if you would like to do so. So affirmative team.
I'm Nick Patel, and my gender pronouns are he, him, and first speaker.
I'm Ronan Pineda, second speaker, and my name is he, him.
Joe Howard's third speaker, he, him.
Caleb Leopard's third speaker, he, him.
Sophie Burnett, second speaker, she, her.
Robert Donahoe, first speaker, he, him.
Awesome. And then if we could get the adjudicators to introduce yourself with the same process, please.
Good. My name's Cleo Wine. I'm one of your judges today.
I'm Nick. The pronoun he.
Zach, the pronoun he.
Awesome. The motion for round 2 is this House would ban private car usage within city centres, so for example CBDs and inner suburbs of major urban areas. Without further ado, I'd like to call out the first speaker of the affirmative team, Nick, to open the case today.
The widespread, idealised use of private vehicles for individual purposes has led to an array of issues both for everyday citizens and their environment. The extent to which private vehicles are used in the status quo has led to a situation which simply cannot be maintained. On our side, we propose a solution which aligns towards the best interests of society and makes way for the future. So the model we propose on our side of the house is as follows. Of course, banning the use of all private vehicles within the parameters of major urban areas. This would include private taxi services. Public transport services would of course be newly funded by an increasing customer base towards their service. And this will open up like a large number of routes and a large number of passages which normally wouldn't previously exist. And also will result in a refocus of the government towards public transport services, will allow for new routes to be opened by the government in any areas potentially uncovered prior. So in order to support our case today, as the first speaker, I'll be talking about the unequal nature of private vehicle use and its outcomes, following on to the effect on the environment and its impacts. And my second speaker will be talking about cultural change away from vehicle ownership. So firstly, on the unequal nature of private vehicle use. For this, we've really got to ask, who actually uses private vehicles, right? Like owning a car for private use is a major cost and a privilege for a single individual to be able to enjoy and attain. Lower socioeconomic individuals are often in a financial position where they cannot afford a car, right? Like for example, your single mother living paycheck to paycheck, right? Like trying to raise children, combined with the extreme living costs which come with living in a major urban area, right? And it's only those with the actual with a disposable income who can actually afford a car, right? Including the expenses which come with it. Again, registration, insurance, and of course the parking costs, right? That's a unique aspect of living in these major urban areas. That's another privilege, to be able to afford these massively high parking costs, as well as the car expenses which come with it. So what is our issue with this on our side of the house? Well, to begin with, it's these well-off socioeconomic individuals who are able to utilize these private vehicles, and that means also that it is the same individuals who are contributing to all the negative environmental impacts which come with vehicle use and the emissions of private vehicles, right? Then the issue with this is that it's then the entirety of the population who suffer the environmental effects and outcomes of such use and emissions which come with private vehicle use, right? And then the next aspect of this is it's then the lower socioeconomic individuals, right? Those same ones who couldn't afford a car in the first place, who pay the highest price for the environmental impact caused by these well-off individuals and their utilization of cars and production of emissions. So why does this happen, right? Well, it's the rich who can afford like the increased living costs which come with the effects of pollution on crops and like therefore like food prices, and they can afford to quickly relocate when like sea levels rise and they need to purchase a new home, right? Like it's therefore contributing to all these issues, but it's only like these well-off rich individuals who can get away with it, get off scot-free without having like such an impact which we experience the lower socioeconomic individuals, right? There's these like poor individuals who are left working in the polluted areas around factories and industrial areas where nobody else wants to work, right? Like by this time, the rich people have already escaped away, they're able to afford making their way at like escaping from all these environmental impacts which they solely are contributing toward, right? That all goes back to like, you've got to have disposable income to be able to afford a car in the first place. And like, it's these low socioeconomic individuals who are most liable to health effects and actual environmental impacts, and the poor won't be able to afford the increasing commodity prices, which will be snapped up by these rich individuals in the face of climate change. And as the economy suffers, it's the poor who are left suffering the effects. So the point is that those who are like a higher socioeconomic like status face the reduced impacts and issues which they're creating, while the poor are left to suffer like the harshest consequences. So what is the solution on our side of the house? Well, first of all individuals, right, are going to be transported in the same manner, like without these gaps according to the socioeconomic status. So that's the first aspect to our side of the house, right? So like therefore all citizens are then going to be equally responsible for the reduced level of emissions and pollution, which will eventually they're collectively responsible for what is going to end up being a collective issue at the end of the day. On our side of the house, we see that as being a much better alternative than what the negative team is going to come up here and support. And that does bring me nicely on to the next point, which is how like these environmental impacts of their use will actually be reduced on our side, right? So we've covered how like the equal responsibility and equal liability at the end of the day. But now how this level of like outcome is going to be reduced in terms of the environmental effects. So I've got two key mechanisms for how this happens. The first of which is a simple concept, right? So you're going to have more individuals per vehicle. So instead of having like that one person driving around their private vehicle, which is supposed to seat 5, you've now got like public transport services, which result in utilization of like increased utilization of individual vehicles. Like for example, a bus which would seat 50 people as opposed to just have one private car which one person is driving. And of course, this results in less like transportational emissions like per person, right? So you're gonna each individual is going to be contributing less, it's going to be less emissions like per person, and that's going to of course have that less impact on the environment. And then another like bonus, and added like unique benefit which we get on our side of the house is the less congestion which comes with this, right? So you've got that one person driving a car. Now instead of having one person like driving one car, we've got a bus which can actually seat 50 people. So there goes like there's your major solutions for congestion problems. So then you see like we're getting this wide range of effects, and then the engagement is going to come up here and prove to us that the status quo is somehow adequate and is also like aligning with the interests of society. So now also onto our second mechanism, which is around vehicle manufacturing, right? So like there's going to be much less demand on car manufacturing supply on our side of the house, right? So for example, the raw materials and like energy expenditure which you use on a car, like every time the well-off individual decide they need a replacement or decide they need something new, that is reduced on our side of the house, right? This goes back to like the even playing field aspect of everyone using the same public transport services and being on an equal level. And then this takes away from like the energy-intensive processes which are needed to like manufacture each and every car which like an individual wants for their own private use. One thing which I would like to stress on our side of the house, which we'd like to like quickly highlight, is that this intensive energy processes are going to continue regardless of whether it's electric cars, gas-powered cars. It's all going to require the same level of raw materials, same level of energy expenditure in order to be able to accommodate for the needs of private, well-off individuals who feel they need a new car every once in a while. And the outcome of this, of course, is that the environmental effects, which are going to be most pronounced for the lower socioeconomic individuals who couldn't afford the vehicles in the first place, all of this is reduced, a more collective effort, and a better way forward for all of us. Extremely proud to affirm.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and will now invite the first speaker from Otago-Southland, Caleb, to open the negating case debate.
It was really cool to see the affirmative side of the House today try and fix climate change by targeting one of the weakest areas of the problem, targeting the cities, where only 0.05 of the global problem is. We think that it is far more prominent to go after farms and agricultural sectors, which will explain why it is mutually exclusive to us, and not target small businesses and destroy them. In this debate today, what we're going to prove to you is that because of the small businesses, all the affirmative side achieves is this false promise of climate change. We can achieve climate change and protect our businesses. Three things that I'm going to talk about today. Firstly, I'm going to talk about what we stand for. Secondly, how the affirmative side of the House destroys the green movement. Thirdly, how the affirmative side of the House destroys businesses, small companies. But before I go on, a couple of pieces of rebuttal. Firstly, is this idea of car ownership being a privilege. We completely disagree with this. We think that a $500 1990s Corolla isn't inaccessible at all to anybody. We think that it's probably just as inaccessible as paying $8 3 times a day for a bus ticket, even if it is subsidized slightly. And we think, and as we'll outline later, we're also happy to subsidise public transport as well for people on lower incomes. We don't think this is mutually exclusive to them at all. We can help cater to both. But as on to the second point of rebuttal about how we fix climate change, I will go on to that later in my second point. Okay. What do we stand for today? What we support is the status quo with two main changes. The first one is significant. It's about going for more agricultural reform. And I'll explain later why this is mutually exclusive, but we think this is the primary problem in New Zealand, that methane emissions are coming from these farmers who don't actually care about the environment. This is where 80 to 90% of the problem is, not in this small secluded area of the inner city. And the second thing is that we're also happy to subsidise public transport, as I mentioned prior, that people need that, and if that is a problem at the moment, that it is currently inaccessible. Okay, on to our second point. How does the affirmative side of the House destroy the green movement? No. What the affirmative side does is that they destroy buy-in for the green movement. We think two reasons for this. Firstly is backlash. So what we have here is that we're inconveniencing the public, and we see this for two reasons. Firstly is that public transport is dirty, it's late, it's actually not that enjoyable. It's nowhere near as good as your car, your private car, your own car, and it also doesn't take you wherever you want. It's not freedom, right? You can't actually just rock up to your local club. You have to go to your local bus station, go for a walk. It could be raining, and that's actually not an enjoyable experience. We think that probably creates more resentment to this policy than anything else. But the second reason is that we probably see a change in the perception about what's needed for climate change. Because now the people in the city, the majority of the voter base, but not the majority of the climate problem, see no reason for change. Two reasons for this. Firstly is that we have a perception of a green paradise in our cities. When we don't see cars going around, when we don't hear these noises, we probably think that there's not a problem anymore. But as we've already outlined, the problem isn't in the cities, the problem is in the farms. We're still having probably very similar carbon emissions in our society. However, it doesn't appear that way to people. And so they're probably less likely to support policy changes going forward into the future, such as the carbon emissions. No. But then the second thing that we have is that people are already sacrificing so much in the cities that they probably don't see a reason why they should have to give up anymore. They're already giving away their freedom to be able to go wherever they want in the city, go to their favourite bakery. They probably don't see why they have to go and then give up even more for this. So at the end of this, what we understand is that we're not going to have as much buy-in anymore. People aren't going to want to do even more change. And this is really detrimental, as I'll explain now, why we don't actually get the level of climate change, that the level of climate action and improvement that the affirmative side of the House would have you want to delay. Two reasons for this. Firstly is that people's own cars, realistically. We're only talking about inner city transport here. But if we think about it as well, our suburb people, which is often the time where the supermarkets are, where Kmart is, these people are still going to want transport to go there. But if we think about it even more practically, intercity travel is still relevant. People want to be able to go and see their family. It's not all just about the businesses, right? It's about human interaction. And we think that cars are still going to have use for people, and people are still going to be willing to make that investment and use their cars. We think that it is foolish to suggest that cars are going to be completely eradicated from our society, as the affirmative side of that house would have us believe. The second thing that we need to look at is where the problem actually is, as we've already talked about. The problem is not in the inner cities. Like, if we consider that New Zealand is small globally, realistically, the outcome is that we're not going to fix global climate change. The best that we can do is how to fix it. The best way to fix it is target the biggest problem. As we've already told you, when we have farmers completely disrespecting your laws, who don't care about the climate at all, they're going to be highly emitting. Their business in itself already has high emissions. Compared to people in the cities who are already willing to be a bit lenient with climate change, we have this promotion and these ideas being pushed that people in the city probably are going to be more green naturally than these people. So we think that it is far more important to go after the people on the farms. Why is it mutually exclusive that our plots out of the house can target them with target these policies compared to the affirmative side? Well, it's simple, because we have the political buy-in. We have that motivation for more change. As we've already talked about, the affirmative side of that house destroys people who want more, because they're already sacrificing so much, and they can't see the problem anymore. If we see the problem visually, because we can see the graphs, we can see that there is like this problem around us, then we're more willing to create change. So at the end of this point, what you should be able to understand is that we probably get the climate outcomes on our side of the house, but we probably also have people more willing to create change going forward into the future on our technical life.
What is the low socioeconomic individual going to be able to afford? Like a car in constant need of maintenance or registration, or a newly cheap public transport service which they can use by their own accord?
Well, we already addressed this. We're willing to subsidize public transport as well. We also think that, like, as we talked about, a $500 car isn't too inaccessible. But if they have to use public transport in our subsidized model, we don't see a problem with that either. Okay, how does app harm small businesses? So what do we mean by small businesses in reality? What we think is that, like, these are businesses that don't have stockpiles of cash. They're probably like 4 or 5 employees, family runs. It could be a coffee shop in the middle of the city. These are the businesses that are going to be heavily affected by this policy. 2 reasons for this. Firstly, is that they're simply, one reason for this. Firstly, it's because they're going to get less customers, and there's 2 reasons for this. The first is that it's more inaccessible, and that's simply because there's less direct car parks, right? Because bus stops go to specific places. They don't go wherever you want. You can't just rock on up. You have to go to the set position, and from there you have to walk and further on. And as I'll explain later, people are probably going to prefer to go to the things that are near. And these things that are going to be near are going to be the big real estate companies, franchising. They're going to be the companies that can afford to take that land, and I'll explain why in a minute. But what we think about this is that if people are like on the margins, whether it's like whether they're willing to go to these stores in the first place, if they have to walk 10 extra minutes, they're not going to go there. They're going to go to the place that's most convenient. Okay, second bit, why is it going to be the big franchise companies that are going to be near the bus stop? Well, it's simple, right? Because that bus stop now has like a tangible benefit that people are going to see you. It's going to be easier to access. People are more willing to go to there. That's going to bid up the prices of this land. The only people who can afford this land will be things such as Kmart, such as Newark, such as these big companies. These other small companies aren't going to ever be able to compete with them in getting this territory. They're going to be forced away from these areas. They're going to be forced to the back corner where people aren't going to go to them because they can't get there easily. What we have here at the end of this today is that we come to understand the affirmative side of the house wants to push climate change. They can't achieve that. It's completely false that they do it. They're living in a paradise where it's inaccessible, and all they do is destroy businesses who work so hard, make people go unemployed, and destroy communities that have like lived around them for years on end. At the crash stand.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech, and we'll now welcome up the second speaker from the negating team, Otago-Southland, Sophie. Oh, wait, sorry. The second speaker from the affirmative team, Ronan.
The crux of the entire case of the affirmative team basically hinge on a misunderstanding of real life for working class people in these major urban areas, in the large cities in the world, in these densely populated areas, right? Because they told us that it's easily accessible to working class people to buy their own car, be able to go to their comfortable car. We just like to do a reality check, and then it might be fine for them to sit in their ivory tower and tell people, just go buy a Corolla, But in the world today, in the context of major urban areas, where the cost of living are literally increasing as wages remain constant and stagnating, we say it's absolutely ridiculous. In a world where working people are struggling to pay rent and struggling to pay their bills, that the voting team is coming out here today and saying, why don't you just go buy a Corolla, right? Absolutely ridiculous on their cars today. We think these people are not going to be able to actually realistically afford insurance and pay exorbitant parking fees that actually do occur in the major urban areas across the world. But we also see that most of their harms in small businesses came from a misunderstanding of reality, right? Because in the status quo today, the majority of people, the majority of working class people in these urban areas already utilize public transport. They already utilize the subway in New York. They already walk to places. They literally would just walk to a cafe to buy something. That's the reality of the world today in New York and Paris and all these major urban areas where this applies. I'd also just like to say, basically to the attempt to classify this as an only New Zealand issue, right? Because actually the car industry is a massively polluting industry, right? Not just like actually the use of emissions, but also the manufacturing that occurs is massively resource intensive, massively energy intensive. We think it's ridiculous for them to come up here today and tell us that it basically makes no difference in climate change, because that's patently not true. We also think it's ridiculous for them to try and scapegoat agriculture as the single largest polluter everywhere, because the fact is, this debate applies everywhere. It applies in China, it applies in America, it applies on all the major populations in the world, and even in New Zealand, there's significant pollution that arises as a result of cars, right? We think it's absolutely ridiculous for them to try and run away from the motion, basically, and try and, make a fantasy motion on this of house today. Two main points of clash today. Firstly, on the true accessibility of cars and inside house and transport. Secondly, on environment, followed by my split point on the cultural change away from vehicle ownership. So on this first point of accessibility, they basically told us it's much easier to reach things like jobs for your small business and cars. But we told you that car ownership for the vast majority of working class people is simply not possible when they're already struggling to pay rent, they're already struggling to remain in these urban areas because rent and cost of living is so high. Secondly, we see that buses, trains, and subways are actually quite comprehensive in their coverage of routes, and have highly frequent run times, especially in major urban areas where this debate literally applies and there's more run away from that. Thirdly, we say that public transport agencies are going to receive more revenue at the point at which vehicle users are moved away by banning vehicle usage and then move to public transport, right? So there's going to be even more capacity to expand bus routes and hours. Fourthly, we say the cultural change of having wealthy people utilizing public transport will massively improve the quality of public transport, but they were trying to basically say public transport is really bad quality. We think on our side, we actually fix that. Why is this? It's because rich people have lots of political power and voting power, right? So by uniting the interests of working class people and wealthy people in advocating for increased funding for public transport, only outside the house produces this unique benefit of significantly improving the quality of public transport, right? Because when a wealthy businessman goes in and sees a dirty bus, they're going to go to their local government, they're going to lobby, they're going to advocate for improving public transport. Only outside the house improves it. They will basically have to say, fine, if you can't afford public transport, we're going to stuff you into these overcrowded buses. Only outside the house gets that unique benefit. They're actually improving the quality of these buses, improving the quality of these trains and these subways, right? They also told us this ridiculous idea that without cars, people can't travel between regions. We say, and that's just patently false, right? Because my team literally bus down here, for every practice, we simply bus from Bangladesh, Kerry to Auckland, it's just patently not true. Also, on the small businesses, we just like to really check and say, in the world today, the vast majority of the customers already reach there on foot by subway, they walk into their favorite cafes. We think it's pretty ridiculous for them to say that the moment that cars disappear, this will no longer occur, because in the status quo, the majority of their customer base is literally getting it through methods that don't include vehicles. Moving on to the split point of environment, right? So they basically told us there's kind of ridiculous idea that if we improve the livability of cities, there's not cars, there's less pollution living, polluting people's lungs, people are going to be misled into thinking that they live in green paradise. First of all, we want to say that they basically laid out a literal human benefit, a benefit to human life that occurs when outside the house. We say it's actually very good if there's less pollution here, if people living in low district areas, their kids aren't being polluted, having to inhale smoggy air all the time. We say that's actually a very big benefit. But also on the outside of the house is able to actually make well-off people aware of the impacts on working class people, right? Because they're no longer, rolling around in Mercedes-Benz, they're actually seeing the reality in wider society, right? And now to this point of backlash that they brought us, right? We've actually seen the worst backlash against restrictions on cars, for example, in France with Macron, occurred when the government targeted rural workers who required vehicles to get to work. So distinctly, on outside of the house, it only applies to major urban areas, right? So the ownership of private vehicles is not attainable for the working class in these major urban areas. We don't think it's going to impact these lower income people that often have a major backlash against restrictions on cars. There was a total idea that public transport is dirty, it's not very nice to be in. We think this is basically an implicit assumption on their side of the house, is that they're happy for working class people to suffer this in the status quo, right? They're happy to say these working class people have to go on these dirty, like not nice buses. Only on our side of the house do we get the unique benefit of improving public transport. They basically are happy to let people that need buses to suffer inequality that they allow on their side of the house. They just want to protect a privileged minority by able to, go and buy a fancy car, to drive around New York City, Manhattan, and basically have whatever they want, right? We don't stand for that on our side of the house. Let's take a point of that now.
If car ownership is so low and inaccessible, why is congestion in Auckland so bad?
Well, as we told you, the vast majority of people actually use car ownership. The vast majority of people that have car ownership are often more likely to be well off, right? So the majority of people don't use cars. But it's literally a simple math, right? If there's 50 seats on a bus versus 50 vehicles, which one produces more congestion, right? It requires a very small minority of people to start using cars to actually increase the amount of congestion, right? 50 vehicles versus one bus. We think the comparative is quite easy to see, right? Now, continuing on this point of backlash, we see that even if there's some backlash that's going to occur, which will run to the extent they really want to claim, we say that anybody can come up and say backlash for literally anything that is ever proposed, right? So we say that there's always going to be opposition to any policy, and we're happy to prioritize the majority of people who actually get improved quality of life on our side of the house to whatever the backlash of the minority that they want to propose on their side of the house. Now, moving on to my substantive point on the cultural change that we actually achieve on our side of the house away from vehicle ownership, and why this is so important. We see that in the world today, wealthy people in urban areas often set the tone for progressive society on what success looks like, and what commodities are symbols of status for everyone, right? Four mechanisms of how we fix this on our side of the house. Firstly, we actually challenge the status quo where cars are equated to images of success, right? We deconstruct this consumerist culture where people regularly strive to purchase fancy vehicles they don't actually necessarily need for their own everyday lives, right? So what we see secondly is a paradigm shift in society on outside of the house, right? Because when rich CEOs ride public buses alongside minimum wage employees, car ownership has moved away from this association with class, right? So for example, we'd say no one businessmen in Mercedes-Benz in New York City. Instead, we see a market cultural change away from this and towards actually using public transport. Thirdly, we see that there's going to be an impact on regions outside of major urban areas, right? There's in many towns, suburban areas, and community zones. Cars may not be economic necessities, but they're associated with this white picket fence idea of an upper middle class lifestyle, right? How do we fix this? Well, when we change culture in the leading cities of these countries across the world, we also change the culture across the country, right? So we see that it could look like a suburban family choosing to save money on fuel, insurance, cost of cars, and commuting. So instead of commuting by a bus, they contribute to protecting the environment and reducing the carbon footprint. We think on outside the house, we actually provide an opportunity for people to take environmental action into their own hands, instead of this kind of illustrious and never actually reachable idea that they said, if we can basically confront people about pollution, will something fix the world? That's the status quo. It hasn't happened. They basically are sacrificing any benefits we get for this illusory idea. So what do we see at the end of this today? Not only get the environmental outcomes and actually fight against climate change, but actually improve life for the majority of working class people. And we're very happy for that to happen if we unite the interests of the wealthy with the less well off, to actually improve public transport for everyone. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the speaker for this speech and will now welcome up for real this time the second speaker from Otago-Southland, Sophie.
It was really interesting that everyone wanted to tell you they cared about people having an income. They cared about people who earn lower socioeconomic sort of wages, and the only benefit that they were actually able to prove to them was that they were introducing a slightly comfier seat on the bus. And as we told you really clearly from Caleb, that we actually benefit people who are like really vulnerable in terms of earning money. Because on some apps, you're actually having people now having absolutely no income because there's people who are just like aren't, because they just lose all of their customers, and these people are no longer getting the sort of money that they really need, because these businesses are incredibly vulnerable, especially just like following a COVID recession, right? They really need these customers and they are taking them away. Interesting, they wanted to give you some bus seats for these sort of people. Fourth, 5 sort of questions today. Firstly, I'm just going to go over what each side is actually stand for. Secondly, how this kind of impacts as low socioeconomic people. Thirdly, I'll ask, is it actually fair to harm the public for this? And then fifthly, like, what this buy and theory movement actually looks like, and like the impacts of this, and who can better impact the green movement. Right, so what does each side actually have to stand for? As burden literally has to be that they have to prove significant enough net benefit to climate action that could outweigh all of our harms to vulnerable businesses, or to like this is actually a really huge burden they have to prove here, because they need to get enough of a benefit here that they're able to win. But secondly, now we're also thinking about low socioeconomic people. This people is also an incredibly strange stakeholder for them today, especially at the point in time where, like, at the best case scenario, all they could actually get was like comfy bus seats anyway. I know this is enough of a benefit for them to actually like win the debate, especially given all those incredible harms that will be actually proved. But secondly, though, we think that the lower socioeconomic people that they wanted to stand for anyway. We think that like we're getting so much more harms for these we think the company seats literally has to outweigh the heavy burden for them to like buy into climate action. We think that needs to be this sort of toss up here that they're standing for. We think this is never going to be enough of a benefit that outweighs the full climate action. Right. Is it actually fair to harm the public? I'll go over like whether this is actually going to be looked at the systems for efficient, effective policy anyway, but like this is given if it is beneficial. We tell you a few reasons for this, because the most substantial contributions comes in. We tell you that the climate change, the burden to fix climate change is a burden that doesn't actually belong to the general consumer anyway, because we tell you like it's probably more like the domestic governments in China and USA. I thought it was really interesting that they were going to force everybody in China to no longer have cars. We're really interested to hear how they are going to do that. But we think that these people never actually chose to like spill these oils on the peninsula anyway. We told you that these people never actually chose to create these enormous factories that release extraordinary amounts of carbon emission anyway. We tell you that these people didn't choose to deforest the Amazon. Therefore, it is actually never going to be their burden to reduce the carbon emissions, which is like literally 0.0005% of like a city in New Zealand cities carbon emission from transport. But we think that is never going to be a burden anyway. So we thought it was really interesting that first half seems so much of its time, but we tell you that a consumer, regardless of how much disposable income they have, regardless of whether they were able to purchase a car or not, we think that is never something that they're responsible for, because first we tell you almost every single household owns a car anyway. But even so far as they didn't, we tell you that the average consumer in New Zealand is not responsible for climate change just because they own a car anyway. So what harms are there to the average consumer anyway?
Just one.
No. So the only sort of benefit that they were able to talk about here was perhaps like reducing congestion, right? I think this is like such a marginal benefit, and that people probably don't care that much about congestion anyway, because if they did, they probably just like move out of the city, right? Not enough of the benefit here anyway, although north cities don't have that much congestion. Right. Having incredible harms to lifestyles and livelihoods. A few sort of reasons here. We told you this is actually incredibly inconvenient for these people, because they have to park 3 kilometres away, 40 metres into the city just to buy their kids a birthday present, right? This is an incredible inconvenience for these people, when it was never actually the ability to fix climate change anyway, which they doesn't fix climate change, regardless. We also told you that these public transports are just generally unreliable anyway, right? Because buses are just always going to be late, they just don't come at all, because there's like there's always going to be those issues because there's like a flat tire or there's just like a problem with this is really big issue. But also just because these public transports are actually just generally disgusting, because they're quite unhygienic, because a kid often vomits on the backseat of the bus, and that's just really gross. We don't get something that's fair to force and normal, as someone just like doing their work commute to have to go through. And even so far as they could fix public transport and make them like nicer, we think there's still an environment where there's people there's just lots of people in one place. There's always going to be a baby screaming in the backseat. It's just really unpleasant. We tell you that people actually deserve to have a nice commute, and in the morning, because it's like when they go to get ready for the day, because they're like going to be a slave in a capitalist system anyway, so we may as well like let them have their peace and quiet for half an hour as they get to work anyway. But especially at the point in time where actors doesn't fix what they set out to achieve anyway, because they actually have to prove some sort of benefit to climate change. Which was a tiny fraction that are able to fix. I think this is like such an incredible harm to the consumer who's been and never should have been to fix climate change anyway. Alright, secondly here now, impacts to small businesses. Caleb set this out really, really nicely, so let me just go through what this actually means. And these are these vulnerable businesses who like are so vulnerable after COVID because they're like barely holding on because they've got so little consumers. It means that like consumers are no longer going to be going into these areas. Because of a few reasons, because of like these less direct car parks, because it means that they're having to walk 40 minutes to get to their shop anyway. They're going to tell you really, really clearly that they're going to just, consumers are going to choose not to go into these like little boutiques, and they're just going to order online from somewhere like Amazon. And it means that these businesses are forced to literally close because they are never going to be able to invest in this. It means that they're not going to be able to feed their families. It means they're not going to be able to put clothes on their kids' backs. So they're going to shut their stores they're probably really, really passionate about because they like making handcrafted jewelry, right? This is really, really important impact here. This is an incredible harm, literally at the cost of not even being able to like make a benefit to climate change, which is what F has to prove to win. Right. What does this buy the green movement? I'll take a here right now.
It is notoriously difficult to find parking in major urban areas, and most people just walk the distance to the cafes and stuff. Why do you think I was so convinced that they'll all shut down?
Because we tell them that they don't, because there are car parks in the city. What? Under the side of the house, they're literally going to like remove these car parks because there's no longer like cars in the city, right? They're going to be getting rid of car parks as a result. This is like kind of implicit, right? What does this buy-in for the green movement actually look like now? We tell you there's probably going to be two groups. People who probably support climate action anyway, really, really small group. They're going to be like buying all these because they think they're already doing their part, like facing this really incredible inconvenience. It's not much really changes to them. But more importantly, the group are going to no longer buy into climate action. And to this side, I think this is going to be a series of people, it's going to be a really large amount of people, because so many people are going to be impacted by this. And they're no longer going to have this like political support, because they're no longer going to be wanting to vote for the Greens Party. What was the Greens Party who forced them to like take an hour commute in a bus, or like screaming children who are vomiting, right? It means they're not going to be pushing through the zero carbon act. They're not going to want to invest in renewable energy, and they're actually going to make a difference because the 0.0005% of climate benefit they might be able to prove. That is why they lose the debate, because they cannot prove that. Christ stand.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech, and we'll now open back up to the third speaker from the affirmative team Northland, Joe.
When the negative team came out here today, and they told us that halting car manufacturing, stopping car ownership in the most popular, dense areas in our world has no beneficial effects to our environment. That is when they lost the debate and they failed to look at the effect cars are having on our environment. Two main points of clash in today's debate. The first one is about environmental benefits on the our side, and the second one about the effects on people and businesses. Now, for my first point, which is the point of clash on the environmental benefits on our side. So, what do we hear from the affirmatives, the negative side today? We heard that cars don't solve pollution, because they don't do much damage in our society. Well, multiple responses. The first one is that before Ronan just sort of came out here and he talked about there is some massive environmental effects that are currently happening under cars. whether it be the car manufacturing process that pollutes millions and millions of tons of emissions into our environment, or it would be going down the street and taking 10 hours to get 10Ks, and that's sort of environmental emissions that come out of that car. There are so many different environmental effects that come with cars that the environmental team has found. They've tried to put the burden on farmers and say that farmers are the only reason they're getting environmental damage. But we have shown you again and again that it's actually car manufacturers. What's currently happening on a status quo? Rich people are able to afford cars and use them without facing the bad effects of these environmental effects. Poor people are sort of like forced into facing the consequences. The rich people can hide their actions in the Maldives, whereas poor people have to go with the challenges of sea level rising, or go with the effects of commodities getting more expensive. And the rich can sustain this, but the poor people can't. So what this is doing is disproportionately affecting the poor. Now, also under our side of the house, what we're having is under our side of the house, with more people not needing to buy a car, which stops emissions from going into the atmosphere. We're restricting the amount of carbon emissions in our atmosphere by reducing the amount of cars. So what do we do? Instead of one person driving one car, creating so much emissions, we're having 50 people in one car. And what this does is reduce the emissions completely. It almost halves it because there are less people driving per vehicle. They put up this very sort of rare idea about cars are accessible for everyone. Everyone can sort of afford a car. My main response to this is just a reality check. They want this point about $500 a car, and everyone can sort of buy a car that's $500. Well, first, I want to say that yes, people can buy a $500 car, but what comes with that $500 car? It comes with petrol, it comes with maintenance, because that is a $500 car. They're probably going to have to repair it, they're going to have to get new wheels, so that cost sort of adds up. They've sort of failed to look at that, they've just said $500 and that's it. They failed to look at the repercussions that come on the years afterwards. They brought this idea that, once we take away cars from the perception of the environment, the environment is better, it's sort of good for everyone. Well, first response to this is that I don't believe this is true. Why? Because people, when the government sort of bans cars because of the environmental impact, it makes people think. It makes them realize that there is a problem and they can do something to stop the solution. It makes them think, what is happening? How can I solve this? It puts them in their mind. That is currently what's not happening. So we're taking a step in the right direction. We're telling people that you can sort of fix this. So at the end of this point, we've proven to you that public transport is a massive step in the right direction for our environment, and that the impact on the negativity is detrimental. Now, for my second point of flash, which is about effects on people and businesses. So what have we heard from the negative team? Well, we've heard that they sort of this idea of buses will destroy small businesses, less customers to local stores. Well, two main responses to this. The first one is just another reality check, because I feel that's not the negative team sort of failed. These people that are driving through these central business districts are the ones who are going to be going to the cafes. They're the ones who go to their businesses. They're the ones who's going to go be the CEO and sit at board of trustees. They're not the one who's going to go sit at the meal and buy a candle from a small business. These people that buy the candle from a small business are still going to go there. Why? Because they like the products that they see, they like the things that are in their store, and just because they don't have a car or they can't drive to there, it's not going to stop them. They can walk, they can get buses. They've brought up this whole sort of idea about bus systems aren't comprehensive, they don't take you everywhere, they're not 24/7. Well, again, another reality check, because buses currently, yes, they may be more comprehensive, but under our side of the house, when we have more people going to buses, what happens? It means more buses will go everywhere, there's more demand. Buses will go through different streets they might not currently go under. And even if they don't go under your street, you can walk 2 minutes. I'm sure people won't mind walking 2 minutes and the sake of our environment and our future. They brought up this idea about, the set position that bus stops will restrict people, but again, as more demand comes, they'll go to different places, they're 24/7 currently, that's not going to change on our side of the house. As I said before, even if some stops are missed, they're going to be taken over under our side of the house. And in response to this whole idea of flexibility, reaching jobs at the inability to get to these places, three responses. The first one is that we don't believe that this is as flexible currently as they say it is. They're talking about how having your own car makes it really accessible, if you go for the job. Well, can we just take a reality check again? Because if you drive your car at 5 o'clock at night, you can't tell me that it's flexible to get to your job. You sit in a car traffic for an hour. That is not flexible. That is inflexible and unsustainable for our environment. So why would it be more flexible under our side? Because more people are buying buses. More buses mean that they can go down to my places. It means that bus routes go everywhere 24/7, and they can sort of support everyone, which the negative team will sort of try to tell you that won't happen. It's more accessible for everyone, it will become cheaper, and it will obviously become better under our side of the house. My second response is that even if there is more flexibility on their side, what it's doing is prioritizing the rich. You know, rich can buy cars, they can buy music, they can buy gas, and then they can buy these, like, repairing their cars. Poor people can't. It puts them disproportionately at the bottom of society. We do not believe that is what we want to stand for. Under our side of the house, what we get is a system that is no longer as exclusive or as expensive. We get a system that is fair and benefits everyone. Third point under this idea of flexibility is that bus routes are being as good. Like, what if they said, as I've obviously pointed out, you know, why is this one? Because what we get is a system that's cheap and affordable for everyone. Everyone can afford these systems. The buses go over there 24/7. This idea that it's going to restrict people is terrible. You know, they brought up this really strange idea about buses being dirty, you know, crying maybe in the back seat, people over the seat. But as we pointed out, you know, when these CEOs are forced to go on these buses, what it does, you know, they have so much political change, which is what the negative team has pointed out. They can go to the government and say, hey, I want a clean bus, I want a bus that's not people in the seat. And that will obviously change under our side of the house. You know, as Wendy also pointed out, you know, more people will be going on these buses, which will increase the amount of buses, decrease the amount of traffic, because there's not 500 cars, there's now 150 people. You know, under their side of the house, you know, they've got this idea about dirty buses, and under their side of the house, they're okay for working class people to go on these dirty buses. They're okay for them to sit in queue for 4 hours every morning. We do not believe that that is an idea we want to stand for. Under our side, we have more people going on more public transport, which forces the industry to improve. Under our side, we get increased funding. You know, the government, it puts in the foresight of their eyes, so it makes them wake up. So if you understand, we have shown that the environmental effects on our side are much beneficial compared to the negative side. We have shown that it's much more flexible and it's better for the working day and the everyday business person. That is why I am so proud to affirm. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the speaker for this speech and will now welcome up the final substantive speech of the debate today from Otago-Southland, Robert.
The NED case literally falls apart at its roots when there is a contradiction between their two main issues that they care about. They think that car ownership is so low, in which case, how are they ever going to have a significant impact on the climate if this car ownership is already so low? That is a huge contradiction, and it means that their two main points, they have to pick between one of them. Which case is it? Is it that car ownership is so high, in which case there is a huge environmental impact, or is car ownership so low because it's so inaccessible, they necessarily have to have one? 3 questions to ask yourself in this debate. Firstly, what's more important? Is it protecting business or is it protecting people without cars? Secondly, then, which side protects business, and then also on which side has an environmental benefit? So, what's more important? It necessarily has to be business, because as we've told you throughout the line, and as they've never refuted, we think that business is so important to protect because these are people that are hardworking. They are in a small business. We're not talking about Kmart, we're not talking about Amazon. They'll be fine in their world. The people that get harmed under their world are small boutique businesses that get pushed out from the prime real estate near the bus stops and now have to be like a 10-minute walk from the nearest bus stop where nobody wants to go. We think that it's like great that people in Kiri, where it's nice and sunny, might want to walk for 10 minutes. People in like actual major urban centres we're talking about in this debate, like Dunedin and like Wellington, where it's raining literally like every second day, they're not going to want to walk for 10 minutes to get to some little store, when instead they could just go buy it on Amazon. That's the comparative. You get people buying from Amazon as opposed to these small businesses that actually help our economy. Secondly, then, is the fact that by supporting these businesses, it means that you get jobs. This means that people have money to put on the table. They've got money to fix their roof. They've got money to buy their kids' school books. And also the fact, like, there's a huge dignity of having work. They take that dignity away from people. They take that purpose, that value, that meaning away from them. When instead all of these jobs just get sent to Amazon, where they can be treated like slave labour and have to pee in a bottle. Thirdly, then, it's the fact that we simply do not care about the few people that don't have cars. We think it's a very, very small minority of people that can't afford to buy like a $500 Corolla. That's very sad for those people, but they don't fix them. They don't fix the problem for them either. Instead they have to pay for expensive public transport. They have to buy like an $8 train ticket in Auckland to get from their house to their job. That doesn't improve the quality for them, because they still have to pay so much. It's probably cheaper to just have a car where you might have to fix it once a year and just have like a one-off payment for $500. That's much better than like having to pay $16 for public transport every single day of the working week, every single day for the rest of your life. Their benefit completely falls out when those are the people they care about, but they don't actually benefit them. Finally then, is the fact that people are still going to actually buy cars. They never engage with what we told you at Caleb about how people still buy cars for the suburb life. Like it's just banning it for the centre city. When you live in, say, South Auckland, you're still probably going to want to have a car so you can drive from your house to your job in South Auckland, or drive from your house to the New World in South Auckland. What this means as well is that people are still going to keep their car, like drive to their batch and Thames. We're not getting rid of cars under their world. All they're doing is just meaning that you can't use your car in one area, so they don't get that huge benefit. I'll take the POI now.
Yeah, don't you think that the opening of new bus routes, which is uniquely possible outside the house, will provide opportunities for small businesses in previously uncovered and unreached areas?
Right, so I'm just going to get onto this, but briefly, it's basically the fact that they're never going to be able to fundamentally change how the bus network works. If they want to have bus stops that stop like every 5 metres down the street so people don't have to walk, then they're going to have the same problem with congestion that they talked about. They can't even fix that because that's how public transport works. Public transport works just by having like key areas where lots of people want to go, but what that means is that there's so many people that don't want to go to that area. Instead, they want to be 5 minutes down the road. Those people are much less likely to walk if it's raining, or if they just look like a sore back, or if it's just more convenient to go to the Kmart that is literally right across the street from the bus hub, as we proved at Caleb, and as they never engage with about why it's these large businesses that we don't care, because they'll be fine in either world that are going to be near these areas. They destroy small businesses. They're happy to protect large companies that don't need it. Right, so then just going off of that, we also don't think we're ever going to be able to get better quality public transport. That's for 3 reasons. Firstly, it's because, as I've already told you, it's the fact that rich people that can afford cars, they're still going to have their car to drive to their back. They're still going to have it to drive around in Parnell. What happens, though, is that these people they're probably not going to be using public transport that much to the point where they're able to fundamentally change how the network works. That's not going to happen. Instead, they're probably just going to stick in their suburbs. They're just going to stick driving between Cromwell and Dunedin. They're not actually going to be using it. So all of their benefits fall out about how they can somehow magically reform the public transport secondly. Though, even if they do improve it, it's still never going to be as nice as a car. That's simply the fact that you own your car. You get to like choose how you want it. You get to decide if you want to have passengers or if you don't. And you get to decide if you want to have like loud teenagers in the back of the car. But you don't get to when you're on a bus where you're just there anyway. You don't get to choose if you've got some kid that's vomiting on the back seat. That's never something they can fix anyway, because as much money as they want to pour in, you're not going to just be able to fundamentally change the type of people that are on buses. They're never able to change people just vomiting on this bus. Anyway, it's not actually that important, as I've already proved. We don't think that improving public transport is nearly as important as these businesses and as the environment, which I'm just about to get on to. But finally then, about business, they've told us that people are going to war. We've told you already that there's a huge disincentive on people to walk a huge distance, like 5 kilometers, to get to the store they want. They never engage with the fact that people are just going to switch to what's convenient. The people on the margins that don't particularly care about what products they're eating, they might, in our world, be fine with driving to the car park of some boutique store to get like a nice dress, but they'd probably be just as happy to buy a similar dress on Amazon instead of having to walk all that distance. That is the type of people that get disengaged. That's the type of people that don't do it. Lastly then, on the environment. They've tried, they basically dropped this from first, which is an interesting strategy because it was basically the only way they could ever win this debate. But we think that pollution from cars does not matter at the point in time when the agricultural sector in New Zealand is the main emitter. As it is a global debate, then it's the fact like production is probably the main emitter. It's like Chinese factories. It's nothing to do with people driving cars. That is not a huge exporter, especially as people move to more eco-friendly cars like EVs that are about to be mandated in so many countries. Then they told us about like pollution from making cars, but that is also not huge because cars still get made because fundamentally people still buy cars for the suburbs and for driving in regions. What have we told you and why is that so much more compelling? It's the fact that people are only ever going to engage with climate positive policies when they see an issue. They no longer see an issue when the like inner suburb, when the inner city is now nice and green under their world. They don't actually fix the problem. They put a band-aid over it. People disengage because it looks like the problem's fixed. The problem isn't fixed. They've just made it under the cover. For that reason, they never improve the environment. So proud to the game.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and will now welcome up the negating team's reply delivered by Sophie.
Two questions to ask yourself at the end of today's debate. Firstly, how does either side of the house actually impact people? And secondly, does having enough climate change to like justify the impacts on people? Right. How does this actually impact people? What sort of benefits do we actually bring? What we heard from ACT was their best case scenario is that they were going to get nicer transport for like the working class people who already use public transport, right? We actually told you really, really clearly, straight down our line, this was something we were always having to stand for anyway. We were always having to stand for better public transport, so therefore the benefits they can get are so marginal if they even exist at all. And the second one we think was probably only ever looking at things like comfier seats anyway, which we don't think was ever going to justify the incredible inconveniences to people, the harms to people, actually the incredible harms to the climate, to the whole climate change movement, which was something that they wanted to fix anyway. What we told you on our side of the house was the harms they got. We told you that this really inconvenienced people because they're now going to have to like take far longer commute because they're now having to like walk to a bus stop to take a bus to walk back to their workplace. This is going to be a far longer commute because people are having to be walking in the rain because the name is gross and rainy. Secondly, because public transport is just generally unreliable, so people are going to just be missing things like their doctor's appointments, their kids' dentist appointments. This is just really like it infringes on their sort of quality of life, and all it really took was for them to take the car that they purchased anyway, which was in their right to purchase because they get to choose how they spend their money. Thirdly, we told you that this was just incredibly gross, right? We told you public transport is just something that you probably don't want to be on, and even so far as they can perform it, it's still just a matter of sitting in a crowded space with like dozens of other people, and it's just really loud and noisy and just uncomfortable, right? We told you this was always going to be more expensive anyway because people are having to own cars to like leave the city because that's something that every single person does because no one just stays in the city their whole life. So this is always going to just be this additional cost It was incredibly harmful. But more importantly, though, we told you that it harmed small businesses, which was the most, one of the worst parts of today's debate. Because there are always going to be so many little boutiques in these tiny streets that buses can't actually go their people with these, because there are so many, and the streets are so small, because that's just the nature of the city, right? And we told you that these boutiques that cannot compete with these massive corporations. They're going to lose all of their money. They're going to, and they have families who are going to be so harmed. And these are such vulnerable people anyway, just given the recession due to COVID, right? We think these harms are always going to be so much more significant than getting a nice bus seat to sit on that we're probably going to get on the outside the house anyway. Such an important comparison to make. So therefore, though, does ACT actually get enough climate action to justify this incredible harm to people's lives and livelihoods, right? What we heard was that they were able to get this car reduction. At best, this is purely taking the best here, right? Because we told you all the harms. They're probably going to get the condition of public transport and all the flaws in it anyway. But at least they were able to lower the carbon emissions in cities. This was never going to be enough, though, because the emissions that you get from these cities was never the biggest problem in New Zealand anyway, because the biggest problem was always going to be something like our farming industry. It was always going to be the production from all the factories, right? Just based on percentages, just how greatly that is outweighed though. But they actually never engaged with the loss of wealth for our future reform though, right? They told you that people in cities they see it and they think that the issue's fixed, and we tell you that people have already sacrificed so much that they are willing to buy into other things. What does this actually mean? Is it means that they actually had to prove a sufficient enough benefit to the environment, right? Which at best is 0.0005%, right? On a global level, because that's just literally just a minuscule amount they can give a benefit. It's actually the cost of people's livelihoods, and it's actually also the cost of they can actually make a benefit, and can actually make a benefit in the future, like a zero carbon bill, or renewable energy that will actually make a benefit. So we actually beat them here and win them on their benefits anyway, about the benefits to climate action. That is why we're in this space, right? This is not the cost of people's lives and livelihoods. Incredibly proud to stand.
At the end of this debate, the entirety of the filmmaking's case basically rested on the refusal to acknowledge that the mass majority of working class people in major urban areas where this debate is literally set do not own cars in the status quo. That is something they fail to grapple with. And when they tell us down the line about the disgusting conditions, about the uncomfortability, about the disruption of these terrible public transport services, we think they basically condemn these working class people, the majority of people in these densely populated urban areas, to this life. That's what they were had to stand for on their side of the house. On our side of the house, from first, we never put the burden on these poor working class people. We put the burden on the rich minority in these urban areas who are able to afford transport, afford the exorbitant cost of parking, and actually afford all of these very costly things in their lives. We're happy to put the burden on these wealthy people because they're not the ones who actually suffer the actual impacts of their car usage, who actually suffer the pollution, who suffer the congestion, whose kids actually inhale smog on the streets of these cities. Three main points to pass you in this debate. Firstly, on environment, secondly, on the accessibility of car ownership, and thirdly, on the quality of public transport on either side of the house. Now, quickly on this environmental point, because basically the entire harm they basically tried to pin on us was that there'd be sudden death of the green movement that people not choking on smog. But what we gave you is a comprehensive response as to why the backlash will not be significant at second, and it's something that they never actually grappled with on their side of the house, right? But what did we also told you? We told you that they were willing on their side of the house to sacrifice a real human benefit to people's lives of having less, toxins in their own lungs, just so that they can, for a theoretical climate movement that they think will be produced purely by having more cars on the streets, right? Why is this ridiculous? Well, first of all, we see that people can still see graphs of rising sea levels, they can still see animals going extinct. There are still many incentives and metrics by which they can understand that climate change is happening. This is why very traditionally clean countries like Norway and New Zealand actually have very strong climate movements because they're actually able to distinguish between these things. I think it's ridiculous on their side house to say that people are literally not choking on smog in the streets, that they won't care about climate change. But how do we actually get a better improvement? What should we told you? We see that when we actually see an improvement in livability, we actually motivate people towards climate action because they see the tangible impacts of climate policy on their everyday lives. It becomes very real and very tangible for them to experience. Moving on to this point of cultural change, right? Because we told you that the cultural change of disassociating status of cars would actually reduce emissions off the board. And this is something they basically ignored all material on as second. And then they notice this contradiction that actually doesn't exist, that either car ownership is low or there's no environmental effect. But we literally told you from first that it only takes a minority of people driving cars to have this massive disproportionate impact on everybody's health, right? Because 50 people driving is literally equivalent to one bus. It's far more energy intensive. It literally requires a minority of drivers to have this massive outsized influence. And what did we tell you? We told you it's 12 people using this that impact everybody else, right? And we told you this from our principle at the very start, right? Moving on to accessibility of car ownership. So they basically said that poor people should just buy a quote, right? They told us that there's really a tiny minority of people who can't drive. Not only is this just patently false, we literally gave you mechanisms as to why people cannot afford cars, cannot afford exorbitant parking costs, right? Because we told you that rent and cost of living are so high in these major urban areas where this debate context is set in. And we see in the status quo, the working class majority of these cities cannot pay rent and pay all their bills and simultaneously buy a car. That's why the majority of people actually do utilize public transport. Moving on to the quality of public transport. Because this is where they basically failed entirely, right? Because at first they told us they're happy for working class people to use buses and needed. And second, they told us that public transport is literally disgusting. We think they never actually grappled with this contradiction, and they basically said, we're happy to let working class people suffer the terrible conditions of this public transport. We're happy for them on our house. They never actually fixed that, right? We fixed it in 3 ways. Firstly, we said more customers allows us to have, more funding for these services. Secondly, we said we refocus the government towards funding and improving public transport. And very importantly, this increases bus stops and routes, provides more coverage of customers to small businesses across the city. So we literally attain the main benefit of their entire day, right? We told you that if there's a monopoly on bus routes, it literally exists in the status quo when they restrict buses on their set cuts. Finally, we told you on the outside of the house, it's actually able to unite the interests of the working class and wealthy business people to actually get the change that these working class majority actually needs and actually improve services that on their side of the house, rich people are able to escape away, drive away in their fancy cars, and never actually grapple with the terrible conditions and environmental impacts that the majority of the world actually feel today. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank both of you for what was an excellent debate. I'll invite you guys to cross the floor and shake hands, and we'll also end the live stream now.